Herren, wer sind wir und wie viele? Vom Gehirn aus betrachtet wird jeder von uns mit seinen Fähigkeiten und Eigenheiten definiert von Bewegung, von Sprache, von Erinnerungsvermögen, von der Fähigkeit, Vergangenheit und Zukunft zu unterscheiden, ebenso wie Selbst und Nicht-Selbst. Und natürlich von der Fähigkeit, miteinander zu interagieren. So glänzend sie auch organisiert sind, so kommt es beim Ablauf all dieser Funktionen doch immer wieder zu Störungen. Die Tiefenpsychologie geht davon aus, dass bei jedem Menschen zu jeder Zeit unbewusste psychische Prozesse das Handeln, Denken und Fühlen entscheidend beeinflussen. Sigmund Freud war der Auffassung, dass das Unbewusste vor allem aus verdrängten oder abgewehrten Bewusstseinsinhalten besteht. Mit der von ihm begründeten Psychoanalyse wollte er den Rätseln der Psyche auf die Spur kommen. Heute, gut 125 Jahre später, hat die Hirnforschung wichtige Beiträge zum besseren Verständnis psychischer Funktionen, aber auch von psychischen Störungen wie auch zu ihrer Behandlung geliefert. Die Neurowissenschaft kann dabei Prozesse aufdecken, die durch alleinige Befragung der Patienten oder Verhaltenstests natürlich nicht zu erfassen sind. Was aber bedeutet das für die Psychoanalyse? Inwiefern können die alten und die neuen Methoden zur Erforschung des Geistes voneinander profitieren, ja lernen? Um darüber zu diskutieren, hat die Hertie-Stiftung 3 herausragende Persönlichkeiten eingeladen. Leider muss ich Ihnen an dieser Stelle sagen, dass die großartige amerikanische Schriftstellerin Siri Hustvedt, deren neuer Roman Gleißende Welt gerade auch bei uns erschienen ist und auf den Bestsellerlisten steht, heute Abend nicht hier sein kann. Ihr wurde vor wenigen Stunden, nämlich heute Nacht unserer Zeit, die Ausreise aus Amerika wegen Passschwierigkeiten verweigert. Darum kann sie leider nicht mit von der Partie sein. Sie wird zwar Deutschland besuchen, aber es muss noch ein bisschen dauern. Kandel, diesen wunderbaren Mann, brauche ich Ihnen jetzt nicht mehr ausführlich vorzustellen. Er hat die Wirkung von Psychotherapie auf das menschliche Gehirn erforscht und er selbst wollte ursprünglich einmal Psychoanalytiker werden, bevor es ihn in die Neurowissenschaft zog. In seinem Buch Das Zeitalter der Erkenntnis, die Erforschung des Unbewussten in Kunst, Geist und Gehirn von der Wiener Moderne bis heute, zollt er diesen wichtigen frühen Einflüssen auf sein Werk Tribut. Außerdem ist das Buch eine Liebeserklärung an das Wien, aus dem er kommt, in dem Fall das Wien um 1900. Und er geht der Frage nach, was im Gehirn vor sich geht, wenn wir Kunst betrachten. Der zweite in unserer Runde ist Professor Mark Solms, Neurowissenschaftler, Psychoanalytiker, Leiter der Abteilung für Neuropsychologie am Groote-Schuur Hospital in Kapstadt sowie Professor für Psychiatrie am Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. Er hat Sigmund Freuds neurowissenschaftliche Werke ins Englische übersetzt und ediert. Vor allem aber wurde er bekannt für seinen Einsatz von psychoanalytischen Methoden in der Hirnforschung und er prägte den Begriff Neuropsychoanalyse. Zu seinen zahlreichen Veröffentlichungen gehört Das Gehirn und die innere Welt, Neurowissenschaft und Psychoanalyse sowie eine Neuropsychologie des Traums. So now I will switch back into English and I would ask Mr. Kandel and Professor Mark Solms to come to me to the stage. The title of our discussion, as Hertie Foundation said it, is The Brain on the Couch, Psychoanalysis on the Way into Neuroscience. So I thought we might begin at the beginning with Sigmund Freud. Professor Kandel, when did you first encounter Sigmund Freud and, of course, his writings?
I encountered him by accident. I went to Harvard and majored in history and literature, and I was interested in understanding what happened here and in Austria in the Hitler period. I wanted to know how people could listen to Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven one day and beat up on the Jews the next. And I wrote my honors dissertation on the attitude toward National Socialism of 3 German writers, Jünger, Karosse, and Zuckmayer. you probably, and as one of the few people in the audience who would know this, the younger generation probably doesn't know this, but Zuckmayer was a progressive. He wrote the Teufelsgeneral. He immediately got out of Germany when Hitler came to power, came to Vienna. Jünger was a proto-Nazi. He thought the First World War was fantastic. It rejuvenated people, nothing like going to battle. And Karosse had eine Inneremigration. Bleibte in Deutschland, aber die Seele war im Ausland. And there, while I was working on this, I met a young woman from Vienna, Anna Kress, whose father, Ernst Kress, was a very well-known psychoanalyst. And I got to know him. We became very good friends. And he said, if you want to understand the human mind, you're not going to do it through history and literature. You have to study the mind. You have to go through psychoanalysis. And I began to read Freud, and I got extremely fascinated with Freud. And I quickly switched my studies so I can go to medical school. I went to medical school in order to become a psychoanalyst. In my senior year, I decided that even a psychoanalyst should know something about the brain. Very few people, now you cannot walk down the street in New York or even in Frankfurt without bumping into 3 or 4 neurobiologists, but in those days, very few people working in neurobiology. In New York, there's one very good guy, Harry Grunfest, and I went to work with him, and he asked me, what are you interested in? And I said, I'd like to know where the id, the ego, and the superego are located. He thought I was Meshuggah. He thought I was out of my mind. He said, you know, the way to study the brain is 1 cell at a time. And I spent 5 months with him, and I had the most fantastic time in the world. And I was just beginning to date Denise. So this was 61 years ago. And I said to her one night at dinner, I said, you know, I could see doing this for the rest of my life. But you don't have any money, and I don't have any money. You know, we want to raise a family. You know, it's essential for me to go into private practice. And she said, oops, money is of no significance. Ich muss Ihnen sagen, sie hat das niemals wieder gesagt. Anyway, she gave me the go-ahead, and I moved into neuroscience, even though I continued my psychiatric training, and I'm trained as a psychiatrist. I'm not competent. He's competent. I became a neurobiologist, but I've always had an interest in psychoanalysis.
Professor Solms, what about you? When did you hit on Freud? When you've done a lot for his lasting legacy. So
it's very interesting. In some respects, it's the opposite of the story we've just heard, because I started in the late 1970s, early 1980s, studying neuroscience, behavioral neuroscience. And we were learning about all of these remarkable discoveries that had been made around that time about the neural mechanisms of memory and of language and of perception and voluntary action and executive control and whatnot. But what was missing was the mind. These were all instruments of the mind, but the actual sentient being of the mind was nowhere on the curriculum. And I then attended, I heard that there were a series of lectures on Freud in the philosophy department of all places. And I attended these lectures, and the lecturer happened to be teaching at that time Freud's interpretation of dreams, a precursor of which was a paper that he wrote in 1895 but never published, where he was trying to imagine what might the brain mechanisms be for the things he was discovering psychologically. So I was very excited by this. Here was somebody who was really talking about the actual life of the mind, the lived life of the mind. And I went after this lecture from the philosopher back to my professor of neuroscience and asked him, what do we think about these things today? What are the brain mechanisms of emotion, etc.? And he said, don't ask questions like that. It's bad for your career. And so it really was a true story, that, and it's not the same anymore, but that's what it was like in the 70s and early 80s. And so with increasing frustration, I eventually decided to jump ship and train in psychoanalysis so that I could learn about that side, that approach to the brain, because we must always remember that there are 2 aspects to the brain. The one is the organ, the objective thing, no different from any other bodily organ. And then there is this unique property of the brain, which is that it feels like something to be a brain. There's a subjective aspect to the brain. And that's how I see psychoanalysis. I see it as one member of the family of the sciences of the mind, which tries to study the brain from the perspective of being.
Mm-hmm. I believe you both have, of course, since you both trained to be psychoanalysts, you have also both undertaken the intellectual adventure of being on the couch.
Yes.
What did the experience teach you?
Well, it helped me a great deal. I was even more obnoxious before my analysis than I am now. I learned a fair amount about myself, and I saw things in other people. And at that time, I was also seeing patients. I was a resident in psychiatry. So it helped me a great deal. Also, as I began to read about Freud, and I was now practicing brain science already, I realized that Freud started out as an extremely gifted brain scientist. And I liked him in particular because he was the first one that showed that the nerve cells of simple invertebrate animals are similar to the nerve cells in your brain, Edward, which is saying a lot. So there's homology in the structure of the brain, as Darwin would have predicted, just like there are in other organs of the body. And then he really, he wanted to make his career as a brain scientist. But in order to do that in his time, you needed to have an independent income. And he didn't have that. He wanted to get married. And so he decided he would go into clinical practice. And first, he tried neurology, but there were a lot of neurologists in Vienna. So this is how, influenced by Breuer, and Breuer was doing a patient by the name of Anna O, a really successful sort of psychotherapy with free associations. He was fascinated by that and moved into that. So we have to remember that he came from a strong biological background. My feeling is that Freud, even though he made a number of significant mistakes, is a major, major contributor to psychology and to science. The problem has been, by and large, with rare exceptions, in what came after them. Particularly in the United States, analysts became very satisfied with themselves. It was so popular, everybody was in analysis. They thought, why study how it works and whether it works? We just do this, it's working so well for us. And that has been a tragedy. Mm-hmm. In the United States, there's been a serious, serious decline of science.
I believe in the United States also you do not have had to study medicine. You can train as a psychoanalyst.
This was also true in Vienna. This is true all over. But in recent years, a significant number of people are what are called lay analysts. Mm-hmm. They don't have medical training.
Professor Solms, what is neuropsychoanalysis and how can it help us to understand the human mind?
I think the term neuropsychoanalysis is something which is only possible now. As Eric has just told us, Freud was a neuroscientist. He did bench neuroscience. He contributed to the elucidation of the structure of the neuron. He traced basic pathways. He identified the origin of the acoustic nerve, for example. He did important work in neuropsychology, a very famous contribution to the aphasias, and then moved on to the more complex aspects of the mind, which in the 1890s there were no methods, no neuroscientific methods to study. So it was with great reluctance that Freud abandoned the security of experimental science and moved to purely psychological methods. And it was really, ironically, considering everything that came afterwards, it was in the service of empiricism that he did that, because the only way you could make observations about the structure of the mind in that time was through purely psychological means. As I mentioned Freud's project of 1895 earlier, that was guesswork, because there were no methods to do that sort of research.
Yep. Mm-hmm. One of the most difficult papers you'll ever want to read, and he has a neural circuit of how repression works. I put this in my book. It took me 6 months to understand what he was trying to say. It was so early to even try to do this. It was impossible. And he said repeatedly, when biology comes along, it's going to falsify many of my ideas.
So that's what neuropsychoanalysis is. Now we have methods, we have neuroscientific methods by means of which we can study the same complex mental phenomena that Freud was interested in 100 years ago. And I think that what we're doing is completing the job that Freud started.
There were two other people that should enter the picture, and that is Aaron Beck and Helen Mayberg. In the United States, there was no attempt, no serious attempt, to see whether psychoanalysis works. And then a guy by the name of Aaron Beck came along, a psychoanalyst, and he tested it. Freud had an idea that depression was due to internalized anger. Depressed people are angry, they get angry at their loved ones, they feel guilty about that, they internalize that, makes them feel bad, and if they internalize enough anger, they can damage themselves. And he thought he would see whether or not this unconscious anger was present in depressed people. So he studied the royal road to the unconscious, which is dreams. And he analyzed the dreams of his depressed patients. No more anger than anybody else. But he began to study them and how they function, and he noticed they had a very low self-image of himself. Man, thought that he had not accomplished very much. He was, head of a major pharmaceutical company. He said he was not a very good parent. The kids loved him very much. He had no insight into how much he accomplished. He played himself down. And this was a common feature of the patients he saw. So he made them realize, he talked to them and saying, this bears no relationship to reality. And within 20 sessions, they began to feel better. So he wrote a book so that anybody sitting in his first row could do the same thing, a little cookbook. And he got people to do the same thing he did. They got similar results, and then he did systematic outcome studies. So he was the first person to really, in the United States, do systematic studies of how it works. And then a woman by the name of Helen Mayberg used this method in order to image patients with depression. And she showed there was an abnormality in depression that you could pick up. And if and only if you responded to cognitive behavior therapy, there was a reversal. She also saw a reversal with selective serotonin uptake inhibitors. Mm-hmm. So that began to, in parallel with what he was doing in Europe, began to do this kind of stuff in the United States.
In what way has neurology already devised therapies, or almost reversed therapies that used to be used by psychoanalysis, which we now know do the opposite of good? Are there new therapies that stem from what we know from the brain now? In what way do psychoanalysts already work with the new notions that we have?
There's a wide range of things covered by what you've just said. I think that the bulk of that range is that it's an area in which there's still a great deal of ignorance. I think very few questions in regard to the mechanisms of psychiatric disorders are completely resolved and that we have consensus about them. But certainly there are some outstanding examples, like, for example, the older psychoanalytical ideas about autism are completely discarded now. And I think that advances in the neurosciences and biological psychiatry in regard to that group of disorders has fundamentally changed the majority of psychoanalysts' views. But I think that that's more the exception than the rule.
There was a general thing, Bruno Bettelheim, other people sort of brought the idea that parents, particularly the mothers, inflicted these diseases on their children. Mm-hmm. It was really just a crazy idea. And of course the mothers felt very bad. Schizophrenic mothers, these kinds of ideas. I mean, these are all nonsense. That has been shown to be the case.
Well, I think it's also important, whenever, as Eric and I were both saying, that what we see ourselves as doing is completing a task begun by Freud. There are things that Freud got wrong. Inevitably, it was 100 years ago. There are things that Freud got right. I think that we must also remember the things that have proven to be absolutely correct. Like, for example, the idea of an unconscious mind. When Freud introduced the idea of an unconscious mind, it was like an oxymoron. What do you mean, unconscious mind? The mind is conscious. Yeah. Now, in cognitive neuroscience, there isn't anybody who wouldn't agree that not only that there is such thing as unconscious.
Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, they already spoke of unconscious mind. He systematized it.
Yeah, but I think brought it into science.
I think yes. But I mean, what he didn't, he made his major error probably is his understanding of female sexuality, which was zero. And if you look at his contemporary, Klimt had fantastic insight. If you look at the delicate drawing that Klimt made of female sexuality, just phenomenal. And the answer is very simple. Klimt had experience with several hundred women, and Freud had very restricted experience.
But isn't that interesting, you know, the famous Freudian slip? I misheard what Eric said then. When he said, you know, there was Freud who got no understanding of female sexuality, and then there was, I thought he said Clinton.
C'est vrai.
To whom the same explanation applies.
The Klimt of his era.
Well, Freud believed that most, if not all, of the problems we encounter in adult life originate in childhood. And the American author and very famous film director Nora Ephron once remarked, "Successful are parents who raise a child that is able to pay for his or her own therapy," which I find very perceptive. Did Freud overestimate the importance of childhood?
I think you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who would say that you can overestimate the importance of childhood.
I would agree with that.
The basic structure of the whole organism, and including, therefore, its mental functions, the early formation is fundamental. But that doesn't mean that things can't be affected also in later years. Yeah.
I mean, it's actually interesting. There was a guy by the name of René Spitz who did a very classic experiment, I guess in the 1940s. He took children, infants, that were separated from their mothers at birth and raised in two different institutions. One was children who were raised in prisons because their mothers were incarcerated. These were pregnant women. They delivered in prison, and the prison set up a nursery. So once or twice a day, the mothers would come and be with the child and feed the child. So each child had a lot of interaction with its own mother, and since this was the main outlet for the mother's emotional life, they poured a lot of affection into the child. Another institution was a home for abandoned children. Mothers who neglected, you know, left their children in the street, they were brought there. Here you had nurses taking care of the children, and there were 8 children to each nurse, so each child got very little attention. And you could see the difference. I mean, in the place where the children had daily contacts with their parents, they were like children brought up in Frankfurt. Happy, well-functioning kids. In the place where the children had very little contact, they were terribly deprived. They couldn't walk, they couldn't talk. Even after 2 years, they had serious handicaps, and many of them didn't recover at all. So early interaction with parents is absolutely critical. It's a critical period of development. If you deprive children of this human contact later on in life, it has relatively little impact. But early life is absolutely critical for the development of normal personality and character.
Early life meaning the first 5-6 years?
First 2 or 3 years are particularly critical, but going on to some degree afterwards.
Mm-hmm. Professor Solms, you have done a lot of research on dreams. I have read one study of a patient who suffered from impaired consciousness after he had a brain tumor in his midbrain, which is, I think, the area which fires up when we dream. And the tumor was removed, and yet he still had nightmares. So, coming back to Freud, from your point of view, would you say Freud's interpretation of dreams is his most lasting legacy?
I think that Freud's work on the interpretation of dreams is especially important because it was in that book, published in 1899 actually, although on the title page it says 1900. He wanted it to look modern. That was the first time that he formulated a general theory of the structure of the mind as a whole. So his research on dreams led to a general theory of mental functioning. So in that sense, yes, his work on dreams was particularly important, but it wasn't only because of dreams, it was because of where this came in the sequence of the building up of his theory. There are 2 things I'd like to say about my own research on dreams. The first is, and because I think it's important in terms of the importance of taking the subjective experience of the patient seriously. When we discovered in the 1950s that dreaming happens during the physiological state known as REM sleep, this was fabulous because now we had an objective marker. Then the entire research effort shifted to identifying what the neural mechanisms are that generate REM sleep, because then we know what generates dreams, and as you've said, theoretically this was very important in psychoanalysis and therefore in psychiatry those days. But the shift went away from humans to animal models, because you can do the kinds of experiments on animals that you can't do on humans, but also because we didn't want to deal with all that messy stuff about remembered dreams and words and, you know, subjectivity. Here we have purely objective things. That led us down a path for really nearly 40 years of identifying the brain mechanisms of REM sleep beautifully, which we then thought were the brain mechanisms of dreaming. But the problem is with rats and cats, you can't talk to them. They can't tell you, you know, when you remove the part of the brain that makes REM sleep, they can't tell you whether they're dreaming or not. That was the remarkable thing. When I did that research in the 80s and 90s on human beings who had damage to the same parts of the brain that had been damaged in those rats and cats, that I found to my absolute surprise that even when the part of the brain that generates REM sleep is completely obliterated, the patients still dream. And I thought I must be making a mistake. I went to the literature and found not a single study had been done for all of that time. And not once had anybody thought to ask a human being with damage to the pontine tegmentum, are you dreaming? You know, and this is the kind of mistakes we can make if we don't remember that the subjective experience and the capacity to report on what it is that, which is, you know, what human beings can do, that this is an important part of the picture and you leave it out at your peril. The second thing I wanted to say is that what I did find was there's another part of the brain which, when damaged, does lead to a loss of dreaming. REM sleep remains intact in these patients, but they don't report any dreams. And if you wake them up during REM sleep, you get no dream reports from them. That part of the brain is the mesocortical mesolimbic dopamine system. And what's interesting about that is that this is a major motivational, a positive motivational mechanism in the mammalian brain. And in that sense, it's just not a confirmation of Freudian theory, but something much more consistent with the psychological data that the psychoanalysts were gathering, where it seemed to them, like in fact through time immemorial before psychoanalysis, that dreams seem to somehow reveal something about the inner life of the sleeper. And the fact that this motivational dopamine system is so fundamental for generating dreams, I think helps us to have the pendulum swing back to a more sort of realistic midpoint, where I think that we are able to understand something of the psychology of dreams alongside.
So do people with Parkinson's disease stop dreaming?
Yes, interestingly, you stop dreaming, you have much fewer dreams, you have very denuded dreams, much simpler, much less affective. But when you give the dopamine agonists, you can push. In fact, one of the early signs that you have given too much levodopa is that the patient starts to have nightmares and excessive dreaming, which can herald a psychosis.
Now, Freud, I personally believe that he has such a lasting influence, and we still talk so much about him because he was also such a great writer. He was able to formulate his thoughts in beautiful manner. How important is linguistic capacity for science, for something we talked about earlier, for, you know, a lasting effect on science, on everybody who's, even if they're not a scientist? And of course, also the question is, words can change structures in our brain. We know that now. So is this also an expression of something else?
Well, of course. I mean, every capability is represented in the brain, and it's something that in principle can be developed. I take writing very seriously. I mean, every paper that my colleagues and I write, we all work very hard on it, but I take it very seriously. I think it's important. You know, the New York Times once went on strike. And one of the columnists, when the newspaper came back a month later, said, "I'm so relieved, because how do I know what I think unless I read what I write?" Exactly. And I often find that when I sit down and start writing, I really don't have clearly in my head what I want to say. And only by writing it out and modifying it do I really clarify my own thinking about it. So I think it's extremely important, and I encourage the young people in my lab, and I work with them. Whenever we have lab meetings once a week and people take turns for presenting, I always go over the presentation with the person ahead of time to help them understand, not only understand the science, but understand how to communicate the ideas well.
Professor Solms, is it possible to think something we cannot express in our own words?
Oh, absolutely. I think that we overestimate in some respects the linguistic, representational, sort of cognitive aspects of consciousness and forget that there is also pure, raw affect, emotion. And we all know what those feelings are, but we don't all have the capacity to be able to put them into words. And I think that words, it's a double-edged sword. It's really both the strength and the weakness of psychoanalysis. It's strength because through words, through the unique human capacity to be able to introspect and report verbally on what you are experiencing, you gain access, as I keep saying, to an aspect of how the brain functions which you can't gain any other way. But they also are very amorphous, fleeting, fugitive things, words. They're very inexact. And so, you know, this is the weakness in psychoanalysis. You want to be able to reduce things to... In the Royal Society in England, it says, no words here. Mm-hmm. In other words, if we're going to get to the real objective facts of the matter, we have to get beyond qualitative description, and we have to get to ultimately reducible to mathematical formulae. So in psychoanalysis, you have a much harder time of it getting to that. I'll tell you one last thing about this. I'm busy completing an experiment in which I used as my experimental participants psychoanalysts. Because they have this capacity, uniquely trained capacity to introspect and report in words on their own inner life. I gave them different medications, different psychiatric medications, a dopamine agonist, a dopamine antagonist, a mu opioid agonist and antagonist, and a placebo. So they didn't know which one of these 5 substances they'd taken. I had them on the couch telling me how their affective experience had been altered by these drugs. And the range of descriptions was really depressing. It was very, very difficult to be able to really convey in words something which is as fundamentally, obviously manipulated as a basic neurotransmitter. Mm-hmm. So we know here is the same thing has happened in each one of these participants' brains. They have a unique ability to report on their inner life, and still the results are not chaos, but certainly not as precise as you would like.
In all fairness, you don't change, except in Parkinson's disease, expose the whole brain to a given transmitter. You have very localized effects. So, but one very interesting thing that is interesting about Freud is that he made us realize how rich the unconscious is, how much we rely on it. For example, when I speak to you, I don't even think of what I'm going to say. Most of it is done preconsciously. And this is true for all of us. Most of our actions are carried out preconsciously. And we're beginning to get a handle now of how information moves from unconscious processing to conscious processing. Really quite fascinating, which I think is going to have major ramifications for being able to investigate psychoanalytic concepts. There's a guy called Barr who first developed the idea of a global workspace. He thought that information, when it moves from unconscious or preconscious processing to consciousness, is distributed widely in the brain. And recently, Stanislav Dehaene has tested this empirically. He will show you an image of Mark, for example, but he can give it to you very transiently with a masking stimulus, so you don't consciously perceive it. But if I do imaging of you, I see that the occipital lobe lights up. So it gets to the cerebral cortex, but you're not conscious of it. Mm-hmm. Now, if I show you the same image and you're allowed to consciously perceive it, you see the information propagate forward to the rest of the brain and then back again. So you see this is a visual representation of what Barr is speaking about. You bring that information in contact with many areas of the brain, the area concerned with speech, with action, so you can use that image in a very powerful way. So I think opening up how unconscious processes converts to consciousness, how they propagate forward, I think is going to be a powerful handle to explore a number of these analytically relevant issues. In addition, what's really going on is, with psychoanalysis, you've got 2 important problems that need to be solved. One, does it work? And the other is, how does it work? I think to show under what circumstances does psychoanalysis work compared to other therapies, when is a female therapist better than a male therapist? There are a whole bunch of questions that need to be answered empirically. And then we're going to ask questions, you know, what are the mechanisms whereby it works? So there's a lot of work to be done.
One final question regarding your vision of the future of psychoanalysis. Stephen Hawking last week predicted that within the next 100 years, artificial intelligence will have overtaken the human brain. Do you agree? And if so, is it possible that in some distant time, rather than talking to an analyst or to a doctor, we will be talking to a little computer that sits on our arm or somewhere else, and it does the psychoanalysis for us?
I think that there's I'll go first because it's important that Eric has the last word in our dialogue. I think that this is an instance of us failing to recognize the distinction between intelligence and the mind. You know, intelligent machines more intelligent than our own cognitive machinery is a distinct possibility. In fact, in many specific spheres, I would say that we already have computers that can outperform ourselves. But that is not a mind. The cognitive, computational aspect is not to be sneezed at, but the affective, feeling, sentient being of the mind, I don't see any artificial ones of those coming along too soon. And I think that that aspect of the mental life is as fundamental to psychoanalysis as anything else. I can't imagine a computer that doesn't have feelings, and I can't, I must say, imagine any computer that will ever have feelings. I can't imagine it doing a psychoanalysis successfully.
I was going to make a humorous comment first. I can very well see a computer simulating my own mind, but inconceivable that Denise's mind could be simulated by a computer. But seriously, I think we already, in many areas, have seen that computers have difficulty with what we do. Face recognition we're extremely good at. We now know that there are 6 face patches in we have a larger representation of the brain for faces than for any other objects in the universe.
Which is why we react more to portraits in art than in abstract art. Yeah.
Excellent.
I've read your book.
That's absolutely right. And computers have enormous difficulty with face recognition. Also, as we discussed before, there are so many aspects of unconscious mental processes that are cognitive. For example, unconscious, you can have many ideas at the same time. And it is told, although I never sort of experimented with myself, that if you have a complex decision to make that has several variables, you're better off making it unconsciously, intuitively, because consciously you can really only focus on sort of 2 alternatives. So I think there are many levels, as he pointed out, not only the emotional aspects, which is hard to think of in a computer, but even from a cognitive element, there's a richness to the human mind that is really quite wonderful. So at the moment, I'm really not worried about computers replacing us in the laboratory. I think we just make sure we have enough time. And I'd say one final thing, I want to return to this point we said before. I would like to write a book soon that says there's life after the Nobel Prize. Because one of the wonderful things about having this kind of experience is that you get a chance to really try more difficult experiments, take more of a gamble in your science. And each one of us is doing this. And I think all of us, you haven't got the Nobel Prize yet, but in some ways, in this phase of our career, when we're more mature, are doing more interesting things than we did earlier on. So I think that there's a future for us, even as we mature.
Thank you both very much.
Thank you very much.